It's safe to say that the commentariat is rather taken by Merkava, the go-to Israeli main battle tank that is currently heavily deployed to the Gaza Strip, as attested to by articles such as these. But now that the latest and greatest versions of it have had their chance to be proven in battle, does it live up to the hype? That is a question that we shall be answering in depth today as we take an expansive look at exactly how well it has held up under fire and try to render a verdict on whether or not this much lauded tank is indeed the best thing since sliced bread or bit of paper tiger with all the utility of a chocolate fireguard. So let's begin. Now, we won't worry too much about the technical ins and outs and history of Merkava, as there's plenty of other videos that have gone into both of those things in depth. But for those of you coming into this video totally fresh, here is the Cliff's Notes version, just so you've got a general idea. The Merkava tank, developed by Israel in the late 1970s, was specifically designed to prioritize crew survivability based on Israel's combat experience. Its engine is mounted at the front, a unique feature that adds protection for the crew, while a rear compartment can transport infantry or serve as a medevac for wounded soldiers. Over the years, it has evolved from the original Mark I to the advanced Mark IV-M, gaining heavier armor, enhanced firepower, and sophisticated systems tailored for urban warfare, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. It's on that last point, however, the one about it receiving tailored systems for urban warfare, where the overview suddenly becomes very relevant to today's analysis, as it is them that ultimately decides how well it does or doesn't do in the Gaza Strip. As for what they are, on the Mark IV-M, they include the Trophy Active Protection System, which intercepts and destroys incoming projectiles before they can impact the tank, modular composite armor, which allows it to be quickly repaired when damaged and be able to be swiftly adapted for varying combat conditions, as well as really good situational awareness, such as a camera arrangement that offers the crew a full 360 view of the tank's surroundings while safely locked inside of it. It's a lesson Israel learned the hard way too, because earlier, Merkava's took a bit of a shoeing in the 2006 Lebanon War, evidence of which you can see here, and here. Now though, however, they seem to have got the Merkava well and truly sorted out. So let's move on and have a look at how it's getting on in the Gaza Strip today. Just before we continue today, I want to talk about something a little bit unsettling. Picture this, you're minding your own business, you're browsing online, maybe even posting a few updates on your social media. Meanwhile, dozens of companies that you've never heard of are quietly collecting every scrap of data about you. And it doesn't stop there. People's search sites can go so far as to reveal your home address, family members, even your political views. It's all sitting there waiting for the wrong person to find it, and that's where Incogni steps in. Incogni is like having a personal data bodyguard. They take on the data brokers on your behalf, demanding they delete your information. It's like sending a digital bouncer to knock on the doors of these companies and saying, hands off. And the best part? Incogni handles all the back and forth with them. No endless emails, no forms to fill out, just peace of mind. And now you might be thinking, well, can't I just do this myself, Simon? Well, yeah, absolutely. Technically you could, but there are hundreds of data brokers out there and new ones popping up all the time. Manually scrubbing yourself from each one would take years. Plus, even if you managed it, those data brokers don't give up. They keep scraping, so new info about you every few months, but Incogni, they keep up that fight automatically. It's a 3-step process to use Incogni. You sign up, you let them know what info to target, and then they get the legal permissions they need to act on your behalf. Finally, you sit back while they update you on their progress. Protect your privacy with Incogni and grab 60% off with an annual plan using the code WarFronts at incogni.com/WarFronts. Don't let data brokers control your story. Take it back with Incogni. And now back to today's episode. Current performance. The key phrase at the end of the last chapter was seem to, because while at face value it certainly appears to be the case that the Merkava is doing really well in the Gaza Strip, truth, as Hiram Johnson so famously said back in the black and white days, is the first casualty of war. As a result of this, trying to suss out the Merkava's performance beyond a reasonable doubt is actually a bit of a nightmare. For example, according to the Al-Qassam Brigades, Hamas's military wing, and media outlets aligned with them, the Palestinians have been stacking up tank kills like it was the Battle of Kursk. Take this article as an example, which states, quote, "This marks the first time the IOF, Israeli Occupation Forces, has admitted to losing a significant number of tanks in the war on Gaza and suffering from a shortage of shells and many soldiers and commanders who were either injured or killed in battle. A big claim indeed, yet it provides no specific details on the supposed losses, meaning that we have no way of investigating the claim and verifying it for ourselves, which thusly leaves the article as very much a source, trust me bro sort of situation. Even the picture attached isn't contemporary to the article's publication and instead was actually 9 months old at the time, but to be fair to folks over at Al Mayadeen News, they do admit that in the caption. As what the Israelis say, in what probably shouldn't be much of a shock, they say the exact opposite, with us unable to find a single article from the Times of Israel discussing an instance of a Merkava being destroyed during the Israeli invasion of the Gaza Strip. Notably, however, such mainstream Israeli sources do not shy away from discussing their own military failures, as you can see in this article, which openly discusses 19 Israeli soldiers walking into a perfectly laid Palestinian trap on the 23rd of January 2024, and then meeting a prompt end when the whole building, which had been rigged with substantial explosives, detonated and collapsed around them. Do note too that when it comes to the 2 killed inside of a tank mentioned in the subheading, it appears as though that was incorrect reporting, as the vast number of other reporting on this incident includes them as among those killed during the building's collapse. When it comes to the Merkava, however, the Israeli style of reporting leads to articles such as this one, which say that while Merkavas aren't being destroyed, they could be, specifically like this, quote, "Among the more sophisticated Hamas homegrown weapons is a copy of a Russian anti-tank rocket called the PG-7VR, which is specifically designed to defeat reactive armor systems like those used on Israel's Merkava main battle tanks." So then, with such diametrically opposed stories being put out, which one do we believe? Well, actually neither, it turns out. With the best will in the world, when it comes to matters of war, a standpoint of total mistrust to all media is a healthy one to adopt because they simply cannot be trusted to be truthful. This necessarily isn't malicious, do note, because while there are outlets out there which are flagrant propagandists that will think nothing of knowingly lying to push an agenda, there are also those that are trying to be accurate, but owing to referencing duff sources and ignorance of the real nuances of the subject being discussed, or even just simple unconscious biases, don't quite manage to do so. And that goes for all sides in a conflict. And because we don't want you to think we're huffing our own farts today, we absolutely include ourselves in that too. Do not take what we say to be the end all of the matter, and instead take it as our interpretation of the facts as we see them. After all, the author of the piece today, while he has done everything in his power to remain impartial, has his own lived experiences that lead him to conducting his research in a particular way, so he could have simply missed crucial evidence that would transform his conclusions, or he could just be flatly wrong. We are only human. If we wish to try and at least get to the facts of the matter, then what are we to do? And the answer to that is primary sources, something that in the day and age of the smartphone we are absolutely knee-deep in. And do note the usual disclaimer for such analysis that it shouldn't be taken as fully comprehensive, because while everyone might be running around the conflict with a smartphone and popping everything interesting they find online, things can be and are missed or overlooked. Nonetheless, with that in mind, we took to Telegram, Twitter, and open source intelligence networks and began documenting every single Merkava we could find that had been destroyed since the Israeli invasion began, and we found nothing. The sum total of bugger all. We did find 35 of them that had sustained some damage as of the time of writing, with there being many different Merkava variants among them. For example, when it came to the Merkava Mark III BC, we found 5 in total, with examples being this one, and this one. As for the standard Merkava Mark IV, we found evidence of 8 that have been damaged by enemy fire, with particularly interesting examples being this one, and this one. Then there's the posh and shiny Merkava Mark IVM, which, perhaps unsurprisingly, given how heavily the Israelis have been using it, has taken the greatest battering from Palestinian fire, with us finding evidence of 20 of them having been damaged, with examples being these 2, this one, and also this one. Then there's also these 2, which we couldn't pin down to a specific variant, but also appear to have been damaged. From that alone then, we feel reasonably confident in saying that more likely than not, no Merkavas have been destroyed since the Israeli invasion of the Gaza Strip. If they had been, we would have found them. Simple as that. And it's not as though there's some kind of conspiracy or machination to suppress or keep evidence down of their destruction, not only due to the fact that doing so would be unfathomably difficult in the information age and almost certainly wouldn't work, but also due to the fact that it's very easy to find photos of other examples of Israeli material that have been destroyed. For example, you can easily enough find this photo of an accurate APC, which has clearly been totally destroyed, as well as these photos of M113 APCs and this image of a Caterpillar D9R bulldozer, which have all clearly shared the same fate. If our assessment does indeed turn out to be correct, there's no two ways about it. It would be nothing short of a miraculous performance for the Israeli tank force, as urban combat is nothing short of hellish for such vehicles normally. One of the main difficulties is that urban environments naturally restrict the mobility of tanks, which are designed for open battlefields and mobile warfighting. In cities, tanks face narrow streets, obstacles like debris, and the vertical dimension of warfare, with threats coming from multiple angles, including from atop buildings and from underground. Moreover, urban combat amplifies the vulnerability of tanks to infantry equipped with anti-tank weapons. In tight spaces, enemies can approach tanks from concealed positions, using close-up ambush tactics to exploit weak points in armor with laser-like precision. Tanks also struggle with limited visibility, as buildings block lines of sight, making it difficult to identify threats quickly. These dynamics force tanks to operate cautiously and often in conjunction with infantry and other supporting units to protect against threats from all sides. As for how the Merkava has managed to get around all of these problems and seemingly thrive in the Gaza Strip, we'll get to that later, because we still have one more thing to discuss on the subject of destroyed Merkavas. The one that was destroyed. So, did you notice how we qualified our earlier discussion, twice in fact, by saying, since the Israeli invasion of the Gaza Strip? Well, that was very intentional on our part, because there was, in fact, one Merkava we know of that was destroyed before that date, and the eagle-eyed and eared amongst you may have already twigged which one we're referring to, and that would be the one pictured in the Al Mayadeen news article that we showed you earlier, because, sure enough, it was in fact destroyed by Palestinian forces. It was all verified and legitimate. It happened on the 7th of October 2023 during the Hamas attacks in Israel that started the war. And there's no doubt about it having been destroyed too, rather than just damaged. Just have a look at this picture. The tank is covered in scorch marks, its armor plating is bent out of shape, though Hamas fighters climbing all over it. It's a destroyed tank if we ever saw one. Unfortunately, getting clear information about what happened to this tank is really hard. There's 1,000 articles and Twitter posts that claim to have an explanation, only to then have pictures of different tanks being attacked, usually from after the Israeli invasion, or other kinds of explanations that don't even jump the first analytical hurdle of being grounded in reality. The most useful information we found came from a video buried deep in a Hamas Telegram chat, which showed not the attack itself, but rather the immediate aftermath. And here it is in full. And don't worry, we've translated it for you. Everyone inside this tank was kidnapped. Everyone in this tank was kidnapped a short while ago by members of the Qassam militia here, as we saw with the naked eye, For what it's worth, this claim would appear to be correct, with this footage having been released by N12 News, showing the crew being dragged out of a tank with the exact same damage and sitting in the exact same kind of surroundings. But more pertinent to our focus today, note just how little we can tell about what actually happened to the tank. It's clearly been hit by something, which we can tell thanks to the bent metal of the turret, and it's also been scorched, exactly just as we could tell from the first picture that we looked at. But what can be seen much clearer in the footage is the fact that the flames may not have been the result of enemy attacks, as you can see the sizzling rags that appear to have been stuffed underneath its tracks, right where the fire is burning. Because of them, our money is on the fact that it was torched after the crew was captured, and that, rather than the attack upon it, caused far more of the fire damage. And that is about all we can tell. So unfortunately, with nowhere else to turn to, we will have to rely upon secondary sources for our fuller explanation, specifically from the exact same N12 news piece we just mentioned, quoting, "The tank was turning around and heading towards kibbutzim, but then their tank slowed down. At that point, they also took an RPG hit that seriously damaged the tank. At the same time, 2 explosives were placed on the tank, one in the front and one behind. The tank started to catch fire, and apparently the fire emergency system kicked in, so they had to either evacuate or risk suffocation inside the tank. They ultimately decided to open the doors and get out." The quote ends. Don't you think that sounds just a bit peculiar? We mean, a tank that is seemingly not far off indomitable in the Gaza Strip here got taken out by a single RPG and a couple of blokes with satchel charges? It's pretty fair to say that something is not right here. Luckily, however, we start to get clues as to what that something might be later on in the N12 piece, as, quoting again, "The crew couldn't operate effectively during the attack because the equipment provided by the army wasn't functioning properly. They were trying to save a few pennies on engine hours." Big, if true, to be sure, but is it true? Can we at least primary evidence our way to an answer on that beyond all reasonable doubt? No. In a word, or rather, not entirely. We have no idea if the penny-pinching part of the claim is true, as we just don't have the evidence either way, but the part about the equipment not functioning correctly, that's bang on the money. Let's zoom in on our earlier photo, and we'll show you what we mean. See here how the barrel still has its cover on it, and here this is the trophy active protection system, and its ballistic shields are up, meaning it couldn't see, and so was non-functional. Clearly the IDF had not intended for this tank to be going into combat, and so when combat came to it, it was simply a sitting duck. And that in a nutshell pretty much seems to be the Merkava summed up. When used properly, it is an unparalleled force in urban warfare, but when it isn't, well, then it's just as vulnerable as any other tank. The future. But while all may appear peachy with Merkava at present, will it always remain this way? After all, war, as A.J. Taylor famously wrote, always has been the mother of invention, and the Israel-Hamas war is certainly no exception, with Hamas constantly attempting to think up new tactics and gadgets that will help lead them to victory. For example, Hamas's go-to anti-tank weapon is currently the Al Yassin RPG. Introduced in 2004, it is an indigenously designed and produced weapon, and is, in summary, the end result of what happens when an RPG-2 and an RPG-7 decide they love each other very much and have a special hug, as it combines the tube design and warhead's external shape of the RPG-2 with the enhanced warhead's innards and divergent nozzle at the rear of the tube and a warhead rocket booster of the RPG-7. This creates something that, to simplify it a bit, has more or less all the same capabilities of the RPG-7, just in a cheaper and easier to pump out platform. And because the RPG-7 is not ideal against modern tanks and their thick front and side armor, and that's before you start considering things like trophy active protection systems, Hamas has started thinking outside of the box with how it uses them, with their go-to methods now being to launch them in volleys as to overwhelm the trophy system, fire at distances closer than 50 yards so that it hopefully doesn't have time to react, or use the warheads as IEDs and place them by hand underneath the turret where the armor is perceived to be weakest. The latter two strategies you can see in action on the screen now, thanks to footage taken back on the 2nd of November 2023. And from the fact that we didn't count this particular Merkava as destroyed during our earlier tot-up, you could likely already deduce how effective this attack was. But it proves the point. Hamas is very much aware of the giant hurdle that is a modern Merkava, and they're trying to think about ways of jumping it. As for other methods they could use, have a look at this. The Tharala anti-tank guided missile system, developed back in 2015 by Hezbollah, a Lebanese militia group that Hamas is on very friendly terms with, is essentially two Iranian Dalavia launchers bolted together. It sounds pretty weird, but there is method in the madness, because with the trophy system needing between 1.5 and 1.75 seconds to reload between interception attempts, the Tharala launches both of its missiles with a 0.4 second delay, specifically with the hopes of breaking through the Merkava's trophy system. And while it is unknown just how much damage the Tharala does when it actually hits a tank, we think it's fair to say it could certainly prove to be a problem should Hamas manage to get their hands on any. As things stand, however, it doesn't appear as though they have, with us being unable to find any evidence at all of their deployment in Gaza. And then there's the issue of drones, which Hamas is using in ever greater quantities as the war goes on. For a great example of this, take a look at this footage recorded on the 7th of October 2023, the first day of the Hamas attack on Israel. Quite clearly, it scores a hit, completely bypassing the trophy system by dropping a slow-moving projectile from above. If it had been just a high-explosive mortar shell, the type that squaddies have been launching out of tubes for over 100 years, it would have been happy days, as that would have been very unlikely to cause any bother, but it wasn't one of those. Instead, what was dropped was one of these, a PG-7V, as is normally flung out of the end of an RPG-7. It works by using a shaped explosive charge to create a high-velocity metal jet that penetrates armor by focusing energy at a single point, regardless of its speed upon impact, and against the thinner top armor, which is not designed to take such hits. It could have caused some real damage if it hit the wrong place, quite conceivably destroying the tank if it got through the ammo rack or engine. Fortunately, they got lucky, and it seemingly failed to hit anything important. Israel, for its part, has responded to this by installing cage armor above its tanks, better known colloquially as cope cages. The idea behind these is simple. As warheads such as the PG-7V work by focusing energy through a high-velocity metal jet, the cage will pre-detonate the warhead before it hits the actual armor of the tank, and thus stop the jet from having any effect on the actual tank. This, in the large part, seems to have done the trick, but still, one cannot rule out the possibility that Hamas will think of yet another genius way to weaponize cheap and cheerful off-the-shelf drones. Oh, and do note that some outlets, quite a lot actually, report the tank we just discussed as having been destroyed by the attack, but we aren't doing so. We are open to the possibility that it was, make no mistake, but having spent far longer than we rightly ought to have trying to find pictures or video footage of it after the attack so that we could confirm its condition, we were unable to do so. And so we're verging on the side of caution and just counting this among the damaged. And that's pretty much the situation with the Merkava as it stands today. It used to be a bit meh, and now it appears to be an absolute champion of a tank. But the possibility exists that it will not stay that way forever. In fact, on that last point, we suspect there may well be a part 2 to this video in the not too distant future, because who made the Tharala? That's right, Hezbollah. And we don't know if you've been watching the news of late, but it appears as though, regardless of whether or not Hamas ever get their hands on some, it may well be finding its crosshairs pointing at the Merkavas very soon indeed. Thanks for watching.